In the winter of 1945, Tokyo was a city of contradictions. Streets bustled with people, markets hummed with the desperate commerce of war, and life pressed on as if the world had not already been shattered. Yet beneath the surface, the city simmered with fear. The Pacific War had been raging for nearly 4 years, and while Tokyo had escaped the massive devastation seen in other cities, it was only a matter of time before the full weight of Allied firepower descended. Wooden homes, often cramped together, lined the narrow streets, their paper sliding doors and papered interiors making them tinderboxes waiting for a spark. Factories and warehouses, vital to Japan's war effort, were embedded within these residential districts. For civilians, the line between industrial target and home was almost non-existent. The Allies had learned from earlier bombing campaigns in Europe. High-altitude precision bombing, once hailed as the clean way to strike an enemy, had proven largely ineffective against Japan. The topography of Tokyo, its construction of its buildings, and the lack of heavy industry concentrated in single locations meant that conventional bombs often failed to disrupt production significantly. Something new had to be tried, a weapon not just of destruction, but of terror, designed to bring the enemy to their knees by attacking the very heart of civilian life. Enter General Curtis LeMay, commander of the 21st Bomber Command. LeMay was a man both admired and feared, a brilliant strategist who believed that wars could be won with fire and iron rather than drawn-out attrition. He analyzed Tokyo carefully, studying its layout, its industrial points, and crucially, its vulnerabilities. The city's wooden districts and congested neighborhoods offered an opportunity, a firebombing raid that could devastate both infrastructure and morale. In the weeks leading up to March 1945, LeMay's teams trained relentlessly. B-29 superfortresses practiced low-altitude nighttime runs to avoid Japanese anti-aircraft fire. Crews studied incendiary bombs and mapped the city in meticulous detail. For the Americans, it was a military operation. For the Japanese, it would become a nightmare unlike anything seen before. Approaching the inferno. The night of March 9th arrived with deceptive calm. Tokyo lay under a moonless sky, its city lights twinkling as if unaware of the coming catastrophe. From distant islands, hundreds of B-29s, some carrying more than 20 tons of incendiary bombs each, approached silently, their engines whispering through the darkness. For the people of Tokyo, there was no warning. Air raid sirens had become almost routine, a background noise of a war that seemed distant, abstract. Families tucked children into futons, workers returned from the factories, and the night carried on as it always had. Then came the first flashes. The bombs struck in waves, igniting multiple fires across the city. Small fires became enormous. Buildings lined with paper and wood exploded into flames. A wind, drawn into the growing inferno, whipped through the streets, feeding the flames and creating what is known as a firestorm, a self-sustaining, swirling hurricane of fire. The city convulsed. Streets became rivers of burning timber and molten rooftops. Civilians ran for their lives, many falling into ditches or rivers only to be caught by walls of fire that moved faster than they could run. Rescue became impossible. Hospitals were overwhelmed. Water mains shattered, and smoke choked the air like a living thing. The firestorm reached a terrifying intensity. Temperatures soared so high that metal melted, and the sky was painted red by the flames below. From the air, pilots reported a city seemingly alive with fire, the smoke rising thousands of feet into the night sky, visible from islands hundreds of miles away. By the end of the night, Tokyo had been almost completely transformed. Over 100,000 people were dead. Over 1 million were left homeless. Entire neighborhoods had vanished, replaced by blackened ruins. Faces in the flames. Amid the devastation, human stories emerge. fragments of courage, horror, and survival. In one district, a mother clutched her 2 children, weaving through alleys as the fire chased them. A young man carried his elderly neighbor on his back, only to find the street ahead impassable. Firefighters armed with nothing more than buckets and hoses fought against the impossible, often succumbing themselves to the inferno. The psychological impact was immense. Survivors spoke of the sound of the wind itself screaming, carrying with it the cries of neighbors and the roar of collapsing buildings. The fire was indiscriminate. Civilians, soldiers, rich and poor, all faced the same relentless heat. The city became a living nightmare. The firebombing was not just a strike on buildings or industry, it was a strike on the human spirit. It forced Japan to confront the vulnerability of its people in ways no battle could achieve. And for the Americans who carried out the raid, the operation was a brutal calculation, one that raised questions of morality that still resonate today. Aftermath and reflection. When dawn finally broke, Tokyo was unrecognizable. The smell of smoke lingered for weeks. The landscape was blackened and streets were filled with debris. The fire had destroyed more than just homes, it had destroyed a sense of normalcy, a city's identity, and thousands of lives in a single night. Strategically, the raid achieved its objectives. Japan's production was disrupted, transportation paralyzed, and civilian morale shattered. Yet the human cost was staggering. Unlike a battlefield engagement, there was no clear separation between soldiers and civilians. The firebombing blurred lines that had once existed, leaving an ethical dilemma that historians still debate.
Tokyo's firebombing became a stark warning. Modern warfare had the capacity to strike entire populations with lethal efficiency. It foreshadowed the atomic attacks that would follow, changing the nature of war forever. And yet, from the ashes, survivors rebuilt. Stories of heroism and compassion endured, reminding the world that even in the darkest moments, human resilience could survive. Riders of the night sky. Above the city, the B-29 superfortresses glided in formation like metallic birds of prey. From 30,000 feet, the pilots and bombardiers could see only faint glimmers of Tokyo's lights, the city's sprawling neighborhoods hidden beneath the darkness. Yet every inch of this landscape had been studied in advance. Maps were marked with precise coordinates, districts were prioritized, and escape routes calculated, not for civilians, but for the planes themselves. For the American crews, there was a strange duality to the mission. Some felt the tension of performing a historic operation. Others wrestled with the awareness of the human cost. Pilot after pilot recalled the surreal quiet as they approached the city. Then came the release. The bombs fell in meticulously timed waves. Incendiaries scattered across wooden neighborhoods like sparks in dry grass. On the ground, the effect was instantaneous. Streets filled with screaming people, houses erupted in flames, and alleyways became corridors of death. The B-29 circled above, watching the firestorm grow, the smoke and fire painting the sky red. The pilots described the scene in almost unbelievable terms, a city transformed into a living, breathing furnace. The districts ablaze. Tokyo was not a monolithic city. It was a sprawling metropolis of varied neighborhoods, each with its own character. The raid targeted areas where residential and industrial zones overlapped, maximizing both material and psychological destruction. In Shitamachi, the old downtown district, the fire consumed wooden homes and narrow alleyways almost instantly. Families trapped in tight-knit neighborhoods had little chance of escape. People fled towards rivers, only to find the fire had followed them, the heat intense enough to make metal and glass melt.
In Honjo and Asakusa, the flames leaped from house to house like living entities. Markets, temples, and warehouses were engulfed, leaving ruins where streets had once thrived. The firestorm's self-feeding winds roared at nearly 60 miles per hour, pulling oxygen toward the center and creating tornado-like whirls of flame and smoke. Observers called it a wall of fire moving faster than any man could run. Even districts further from the city center were not spared. The fire spread unpredictably, igniting homes, schools, and factories. In some cases, entire blocks vanished, leaving only blackened skeletons of walls and chimneys jutting from the rubble. The destruction was unprecedented, a testament to both the planning of the raid and the terrifying vulnerability of Tokyo's wooden architecture. Human stories from the inferno. Amid the destruction, individual stories emerge, snapshots of courage, tragedy, and survival. In one neighborhood, a young woman named Yoko carried her baby on her back, weaving through the burning streets as the fire roared behind her. She stumbled, fell into a ditch, and feared she would die, yet neighbors pulled her to safety, helping her escape the flames. In a nearby district, a school teacher gathered children into a small courtyard, shielding them as best she could from the inferno. Despite the terrifying heat and suffocating smoke, she saved dozens of lives that night. Meanwhile, firefighters fought a losing battle. Using only buckets, hoses, and makeshift pumps, they attempted to hold back waves of fire that moved faster than water could reach. Many perished in the effort, yet their bravery became part of Tokyo's story of resilience. Even for the survivors, the trauma was long-lasting. Children who witnessed parents consumed by flames, families separated by smoke and chaos, and entire communities wiped out. These were experiences that would haunt generations. Pilots' perspectives and reflections. High above, the American crews watched the firestorm spread. Some saw it as a brilliant execution of strategy and necessary action to end the war. Others could not shake the enormity of the human suffering below. One bombardier later recounted, "From above, it looked like a city on fire in a painting of hell. I knew people were down there. I knew some would not survive. But at the time, I also knew this would end the war faster." It was a strange, conflicting feeling, both awe and horror.
The pilots were well aware that Tokyo was not a purely military target. Civilian areas were deliberately included. Yet, for them, the mission was framed as part of a broader strategy to save lives in the long run by forcing Japan toward surrender. The moral implications would stay with many of them long after the war ended. The science of the firestorm. What made the firebombing of Tokyo so catastrophic was not just the bombs themselves, but the science behind the firestorm. Each incendiary was designed to ignite wooden structures quickly. Dropped in large numbers and low altitudes, they created hundreds of simultaneous fires. The heat from these fires generated its own wind system. Flames consumed oxygen rapidly, pulling fresh air into the inferno and feeding it like a living creature. Temperatures in the core reached over 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit, enough to melt metal, ignite paper at a distance, and vaporize human skin in seconds. The winds of the firestorm could move people like rag dolls, lifting bodies and debris into the flames. The combination of temperature, wind, and destruction made the firestorm nearly impossible to fight. Tokyo's firefighters, trained for conventional blazes, were utterly unprepared for such an overwhelming force of nature. Immediate aftermath in the streets. By morning, Tokyo was a wasteland. Streets were unrecognizable, landmarks reduced to smoldering ruins, and the smell of charred wood and human tragedy hung in the air. Hospitals overflowed with the injured, many suffering burns that medical knowledge of the time could barely treat. Over 100,000 people had perished in the single night, making it one of the deadliest air raids in human history. The city's population, already strained by war, faced unimaginable homelessness and deprivation. One survivor later recalled, "The city was gone. Where my home had stood, there was only ash and the skeletons of buildings. I searched for my family for hours. Many were gone. I found my brother, but our parents were never seen again." Yet even amid the horror, stories of survival and courage continued. Neighbors rescued neighbors, strangers shared scarce food and water, and some managed to guide children through the ruins to safety. The human spirit endured,
even as the city itself seemed lost. Strategic and moral questions. From a military perspective, the raid was a success. Critical industrial zones were destroyed, transportation was disrupted, and the Japanese war effort suffered severe blows. Tokyo's firebombing was followed by similar raids on Osaka, Nagoya, and other cities, further weakening Japan's capacity to continue fighting. But the morality of these attacks remains deeply contested. Civilians were deliberately targeted to break morale, a strategy that blurred the line between combatants and non-combatants. The devastation was unprecedented, raising questions about the ethics of total war, a debate that continues to this day. For historians, the firebombing of Tokyo stands as both a warning and a lesson. The power of aerial warfare is immense, and its consequences can extend far beyond the battlefield. The calculus of destruction. The firebombing of Tokyo did not occur in isolation. It was the culmination of years of strategic planning, technological innovation, and a wartime philosophy that sought to bring about victory through overwhelming force. By early 1945, the Japanese Empire was faltering. Its navy had been crippled, cities in the south had been captured, and supply lines stretched thin across islands that had once been secure. Yet Tokyo, the beating heart of the nation, remained largely intact. American military planners faced a dilemma. High-altitude precision bombing, used extensively in Europe, had failed to achieve the same results in Japan. The topography of Japanese cities, combined with the prevalence of wooden construction, rendered these methods inefficient. Factories and industries were often small, decentralized, and embedded within residential districts. It became clear that traditional approaches would not end the war quickly. A new form of aerial warfare was needed, one that could strike directly at both industry and morale. The strategy of fire. The strategic thinking behind firebombing was as cold as it was meticulous. Planners understood that targeting civilian areas, though morally troubling, could accelerate Japan's surrender by destroying infrastructure, crippling industrial production, and shattering morale. Cities like Tokyo, Osaka, and Nagoya became the focus of this doctrine. Curtis LeMay, commander of the 21st Bomber Command, refined a new approach: low-altitude, nighttime raids using incendiary bombs. The plan relied on speed, coordination, and an understanding of the city's vulnerabilities. Pilots would fly at altitudes low enough to avoid high winds that previously scattered bombs, allowing them to hit precise target zones. Incendiaries, designed to ignite wooden structures, would start multiple fires simultaneously. When combined, these fires would merge into a firestorm, a phenomenon of terrifying force, capable of consuming entire neighborhoods in minutes. LeMay later defended his tactics. The quickest way to end a war is to destroy the enemy's capacity and will to fight. Firebombing achieved both. Yet the human cost, thousands of civilians killed in a single night, remains a moral question historians continue to grapple with. Comparisons to Europe. While Tokyo's devastation was immense, the Allied firebombing campaigns in Europe had provided a precedent. Cities like Dresden, Hamburg, and Cologne had been leveled by waves of bombers in 1944, creating firestorms that killed tens of thousands. In Europe, the focus was primarily industrial and military, but civilian areas inevitably suffered. In Japan, however, the context was different. Cities were denser, constructed almost entirely of wood, and surrounded by narrow streets that facilitated the spread of fire. The results were catastrophic. One night in March 1945 killed more people in Tokyo than most European cities experienced over months of bombing. The scale of destruction highlighted the unique vulnerability of Japanese cities and underscored the devastating potential of incendiary warfare. The political decisions behind the raids. The firebombing of Tokyo was also a product of political calculation. President Franklin D. Roosevelt and his military advisors faced immense pressure to end the war in the Pacific swiftly.
Conventional invasion plans promised enormous casualties on both sides. The projected cost of a full-scale land invasion of Japan was staggering, with estimates ranging into the millions for military and civilian lives. In this context, aerial bombing campaigns became a tool not just of military strategy, but of political expediency. By demonstrating the destructive power of American air forces, policymakers hoped to compel Japan toward surrender without the need for an invasion. In the minds of some planners, firebombing was the lesser of two evils. Horrific as it was still preferable to a drawn-out ground war that would consume countless more lives. LeMay's raids on Tokyo were the opening salvo of this strategy. The destruction wrought that night sent a clear signal. Japan's cities were vulnerable, and the cost of continued resistance would be catastrophic. Impact on Japanese morale and government. For the people of Tokyo, the firebombing shattered the illusion of safety. No longer could civilians hide behind the assumption that cities would be spared from modern warfare. Fear became pervasive. Night after night, the memory of burning streets, collapsing homes, and screaming neighbors haunted survivors.
The government, meanwhile, was forced to respond. Civil defense measures were hastily organized, including evacuation drills, fire watch teams, and emergency shelters. Yet these efforts were largely insufficient against the magnitude of the destruction. The firebombing forced the Japanese military and political leadership to confront a sobering reality. The war could no longer be fought on their terms, and civilian suffering had reached an unprecedented scale. Some officials argued for continued resistance, believing that the Americans would eventually exhaust themselves. Others recognized the futility of prolonging the conflict, understanding that further raids or a potential atomic strike could annihilate Tokyo completely. The firebombing thus became a pivotal moment in Japan's path towards surrender, demonstrating the lethal efficiency of modern air power and reshaping wartime calculations. Voices from the ruins. Accounts from survivors of the firebombing provide a haunting glimpse into the human experience of that night. One man, Hiroshi, recalled running with his family through the burning streets of Shitamachi. "The fire chased us like a living thing. We fell into the river to escape the heat, but the smoke followed. I thought we would die there. My sister did not survive." A nurse named Keiko described the chaos in hospitals. "We had no electricity, no water. The wounded burned, moaning. We could do nothing to stop the suffering." That night, the city itself seemed to cry. Even Japanese soldiers stationed in the city reported the surreal scale of destruction. Entire barracks were engulfed, supply lines severed, and communication disrupted. The firestorm left the city paralyzed, demonstrating that modern warfare could strike deep into the heart of a nation, bypassing conventional defenses entirely. The firebombing in historical perspective. The raid on Tokyo remains one of the deadliest air attacks in history. Estimates of the death toll vary, but most agree that over 100,000 civilians perished in a single night, with countless others injured or displaced. The destruction of housing, infrastructure, and industrial capacity was near total in targeted areas.
Historians viewed the firebombing as a turning point in the Pacific War. It showcased the power of the B-29, the effectiveness of incendiary strategies, and the terrifying potential of total war. At the same time, it sparked debate about the ethics of targeting civilians, a debate that continues to influence military and humanitarian thinking to this day. The firebombing also foreshadowed the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Tokyo had demonstrated that even conventional bombs, when deployed strategically, could destroy a city and break morale. The atomic strikes, arriving months later, would amplify these lessons to a new, unimaginable level.
The firebombing left deep psychological scars on the population. Survivors, traumatized by the sight of their city burning and the screams of neighbors, often suffered from nightmares, anxiety, and depression. Children were particularly vulnerable, growing up in an environment where death and destruction had become commonplace. Many recounted vivid memories of the night, the heat that seared their skin, the winds of the firestorm that carried bodies and debris, and the feeling of hopelessness as familiar streets vanished. These experiences would shape the collective consciousness of post-war Japan, influencing literature, film, and art for decades to come. Psychologists studying survivors noted patterns similar to what would later be identified as post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. The firebombing, combined with years of wartime deprivation, left an indelible mark on the mental health of the population. Entire generations carried the burden of that night, and the trauma would echo through families long after the war ended. Rebuilding a destroyed city. The task of rebuilding Tokyo was monumental. The city's infrastructure had been decimated. Roads, bridges, and railways were destroyed, cutting off transportation and isolating neighborhoods. Factories lay in ruins, making it difficult to restart industrial production. Homes had vanished, leaving millions without shelter. Despite these challenges, reconstruction began almost immediately. Temporary housing, known as barrack villages, sprung up to accommodate the displaced population. Volunteer groups, aided by the government, worked to clear debris and restore basic services. Electricity and water systems were gradually repaired, and schools reopened to provide a sense of normalcy for children. The reconstruction of Tokyo was also symbolic. It represented not just the physical rebuilding of a city, but the resilience and determination of its people. Over the following years, Tokyo would rise from the ashes, modernizing its infrastructure and architecture in ways that reflected lessons learned from the firebombing.